I'm going to talk through very quickly the market failure policies, and in particular these are the ones that we're going to look at from the point of view of the OCR board, which quite rightly says that if you are trying to evaluate a policy such as taxes, you can't evaluate until you have correctly analysed how it works in the market. So this was a particular example about the problem of chewing gum being discarded, and so they gave you 4 different options to consider, and they said in terms of analysing this before you make a judgment as to which is the best one, you really have to say, for example, with indirect taxes, have a look at this, it says that you will have to, the indirect tax will lead to a shift of the supply curve, less is being supplied and consumed, and therefore that will reduce the inappropriate disposal of gum. It's very important that you see that what a lot of candidates didn't do is they didn't look at the discarding of gum, so read the question very carefully. But the key I'm trying to get to here is that you have to explain exactly how an indirect tax works. And if you want to know something of that, then you can go to my other video on subsidies, which is the opposite of an indirect tax, but it explains exactly how this will work. Now, in terms of regulation, which was one of the things that they said could be done, this is quite interesting here. They say that regulation can be shown as a shift to the left of the supply curve. And we'll look at another example in a minute. So you can say if they ban or regulate chewing gum, it'll effectively shift the supply curve of producers to the left. But they also suggest that you can suggest that regulation or a ban or even information provision can be shown as a shift to the left of the demand curve, particularly when the consumers change their behaviour. So if you regulated, and this one was saying you're going to get fined, then you might change your behaviour and you will do less of the discarding of chewing gum. This one was talking about the use of a subsidy, okay, to encourage production and consumption of these positive externalities, and this is key here. If you look at this one first, they're saying that you have to analyse giving the subsidy producers will lead to lower costs, shifting the supply curve, falling price, and that will then lead to an increase in consumption or demand. If you don't say that, if you just gave them the diagram and then say that increases the quantity, you will not get through to this magical level 3, what they now call band 2. So if you just said the fall in the price increases the quantity in the market, no mention of consumption, that's not going to be good enough. If you said the fall in price leads to an increase in the consumption or the demand or movement along the quantity, of demand curve, or increase in quantity demanded, then you'll get to this magical band 2. Just to have a look at here, tells you here that in this, that's another example here of a subsidy. Basically, band 1 is if you shift the supply curve, reducing their costs because their producer costs are reduced effectively. This leads to a price fall. You only get to band 1. You then have to say it increases the quantity being demanded in the market and the quantity demanded from the consumer. And again, linking it to the under-provision of new housing, again being very specific to answer the question. They make that clear here. You can't progress from band 1 to band 2 without analysing how the subsidy changes this quantity. This one here is a question about regulation being the solution to the problem. And again, let's start with band 1. Alright, if you have a diagram just showing a shift of the demand or the supply, you can do either of that with regulation to the left, and then you say this reduces the quantity traded in the marketplace, you only get to band 1. And so what you have to do is you have to explain that you may have a vertical supply curve at the point where you want the market to go. You might want to explain that supply falls because of the increased costs of doing the regulation from the firm's point of view. You might say that the regulation means that consumers are now made aware of the harmful effects of this fast food, therefore the demand falls. You might want to say that there's a development then of how that fall from QE to Q1 corrects the market failure. So you've always got to get through to correction of market failure. And lastly, just looking at their mark schemes, again, this was a regulation question, and again, level 3, band 1, you shift the demand or supply curve to the left with regulation, then an explanation, it reduces the quantity, which is what we saw in the previous slide, but this is very useful here for looking at. So band 1, you get a diagram showing a vertical supply curve to the left of equilibrium, in other words, reducing the quantity being traded in the market. You might say the supply shifts to the left because it increases the costs. You might say demand shifts to the left because it's more difficult to obtain the product. Price rises, you might identify, and even the quantity falls. But unless you say this solves the consumption and it reduces consumption, unless you say this is a reduction in the consumption in the market on the consumer side, then you're not going to get to this magical band 2. Okay, so you need to say also it moves the market to be more allocatively efficient, and welfare is increased as well, possibly. But usually this would be sufficient to say it solves the problem. Okay, information provision is another one that you need to think about, and what basically information does is it says it moves your demand curve. So this is the old demand curve with the old equilibrium, and it can go either way. As you can see, I've done it in blue and red for you. So if they gave information about how good the product is for the consumer, because it's being underconsumed in the market, we don't know how good it is, and that would be a merit good, then you are saying that the demand will move to the right and your consumption will increase, and you're moving to have more consumption because you're willing and able to pay a higher price for the good. And so the market equilibrium gets to Q1, which solves the problem of the merit good. If, however, we're talking about a demerit good and we want to give better information, this better information tells us how bad the product is. That then moves you demand curve down to this curve, therefore the equilibrium moves down here, and at this lower price then basically the consumer will not demand so much. So you've got to look at it from a consumer point of view. You could look at it also from the producer point of view. Producers getting less money in the market, less price. Therefore you could argue that they're not going to produce as much. So both from the consumption and the production we get to Q1. I think an added bonus with the information provision is this, that if the government provide the information, then it's not going to affect the supply curve of the firm. But take this one where we said that the product is bad for us. This was perhaps an example of the fast food question. Then if we give information, what we said before, yeah, it'll reduce the demand curve, but also if the firm have to put it on and provide information by putting calories printed on their products, it's going to add to their costs. So if that adds to their costs, the supply also could possibly move. But it only moves if the firm has to give the information. If the government gives it, then you wouldn't move that supply curve. Regulation, this is the way I prefer to see it, is that you can have the supply with regulation here. In other words, this is the old equilibrium. We don't want that. We wanted to move the market back to Q1, and basically the government might simply regulate and say this is the supply that we're allowing, and so you can simply draw a supply curve now. Instead of this old one, the supply curve is moving in. You cannot produce as an industry more than this quantity here. Now effectively, if you want to get a little bit more detailed on this, you could say, well, the supply curve, I've drawn it as a dotted line. When you're below this regulation, obviously the firms will be able to supply and increase their supply at increasing price, but after that you will move on to this supply curve. We can't get onto this supply curve. This one here, that part of the supply curve, is not possible anymore. And so our new supply curve is this one. Okay, that would mean that the price will rise in the market, the consumer will reduce their demand, and you get to Q1 in the market solving the problem. Another alternative of regulation, as it says in those mark schemes, is that you can say that if there's a regulation, it can increase the costs of firms, so you can move your supply curve. Increased costs will increase the price at which they're willing and able to supply. But you can also say, if it makes it difficult for the consumers to obtain the product because of this regulation, that the demand might also shift in. That's another way of showing regulation. Pollution permits is like a regulation really, and I think the best way to show this in the market would be saying that the supply in the market is reduced. So in other words, the government says this is the only quantity we will allow in the market, and in order to allow that quantity we'll give them permits to pollute. But this is a special case, and I'm not going to go into detail here about how those work. One of the things you could use with pollution permits, though, is this idea that if there's heavy polluters, then they need to have more permits. So the government effectively give permits to all the firms, but those who are heavy polluters, they need more, and so it's going to add to their costs, and so these heavy polluters, you might argue, will reduce their quantity, which solves the problem really, because it's those that have been causing the market failure the most. And finally, government provision. You basically simply have to say that this supply curve no longer exists, and the government will provide the optimum quantity Q1 in the marketplace. And this is usually for things like health and education, where you would say that there's no longer a supply curve, so therefore the government will provide a quantity of Q1 in the marketplace, and so that will then get you to this was the optimum point in the marketplace. So hopefully that helps you to go through some of the diagrams if you need them, but the key is, do not state. You cannot state that if a policy is applied, this will increase the quantity being traded and therefore solve the market failure problem. You can't just state it. You've got to get behind and explain the effect on the consumer, and possibly sometimes the effect on the producer if you can.